Welcome to Autism ADHD TV with Holly. That's me, a neurodivergent therapist, mom, and passionate advocate for affirming approaches. Maybe you're a parent trying to support your neurodivergent child or teen, a therapist or educator wanting to learn more, or you're a neurodivergent person looking for strategies that truly honor who you are. Whatever brought you here, you're in the right place. We talk about the real stuff: emotional regulation, self-awareness, executive functioning, self-advocacy skills that build confidence, social connections that are authentic, and so much more. And hey, if you're looking for deeper learning, check the description notes below for information on my parent workshops and continuing education trainings for therapists. You're going to love it. Make sure to hit that subscribe button and give us a like so you never miss out. And if you find Autism ADHD TV helpful, please share it with someone, because together we can create more understanding about neurodiversity. Now let's get into it. Welcome, Catherine Muty Driscoll, to the Autism ADHD podcast.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm so excited to be here.
And I am so excited I got your name after
You did that amazingly. You didn't say muddy, so thank you so much.
I always have to make sure, because I sometimes will not get it right. Catherine, you work at the Hallowell Todaro ADHD Center, which so many people know about, as the Director of Executive Function Coaching. Catherine loves to learn and, as a result, has a variety of degrees and certifications. Currently, she's pursuing her master's in clinical mental health counseling. In June 2024, she'll publish her first book, the ADHD Workbook for Teen Girls: Understand Your Neurodivergent Brain, Make the Most of Your Strengths, and Build Confidence to Thrive. And we'll definitely be talking about your book at the end, because it is now available for pre-sale. And everyone, we are talking about brain shame. And I came upon your blog, which I love, where you talk about brain shame and the way that you described it. I thought, oh, my audience has to hear about this.
Great. Yeah, I think it's a really interesting idea, and it's not something you always hear about. I'll tell you where I came across it. Reading the Radical Guide for Women with ADHD was where I first saw the concept, and you don't see it around too much, but it's a really interesting and meaningful idea, I think.
Catherine, please describe brain shame.
Brain shame is the shame that folks with ADHD and autism accrue based on negative experiences with their executive function skills. Executive function skills are brain-based skills that help us get things done. These include a variety of things you wouldn't expect to be brain-based skills. For example, working memory, also the ability to think flexibly in the moment. Emotional control is a brain-based skill. Task initiation, organization, attention and focus, impulse control, timekeeping, planning, prioritization, and self-monitoring. So all those things are brain-based skills. What does that mean? That means that some of us are struggling with some and having an easy time with others, but it's not our fault. It's our brain. And the fact that for a lot of us with ADHD and autism, our skills develop at different rates through no fault of our own. However, society doesn't understand that some of these challenges aren't our fault. And so when we receive negative feedback about them, when we read self-help books and we can't do the strategies, then we can develop a lot of shame around our challenges. So for me, just like a lot of folks with ADHD and autism, I have some skills that I'm great at, like actually time management. Who knew? However, I have some that I'm really bad at, like organization, which is an unfortunate one because I'm a girl, right? And you're expected to be good at that. You're expected to have a clean house and easily cook, and those things are really hard for me. However, I didn't realize that this was a brain-based thing. I just thought it was an issue with me until I was 37 and got diagnosed. So I developed a lot of shame around it because so many people would say, Catherine, you're so smart, but why can't you keep your room clean? And that was really tough to hear. And I took it really personally, and I tried and I failed. And I just thought it was my fault.
There is so much shame around that. It really is so hard to understand why you can't do things, especially when someone else expects it from you. And then you, of course, will get that negative feedback when their expectation isn't met. When you were talking about your room, oh, I was just so feeling that, Catherine, because my room was always a mess and I was always in trouble. And then we start to tell ourselves, right, I'm bad at this. Something's wrong with me. Did you experience that too when you said you took it personally?
Definitely. And for those of you who haven't seen the Radical Guide for Women with ADHD by Sari Solden and Michelle Frank, they have a great discussion of how women with ADHD can go from, I have a messy desk or a messy room, and then they receive negative feedback about that. And then now they've distorted that into I'm a bad person, because brains are likely to distort these small things and make them a generalization about oneself, especially if you don't know why and you were trying to clean it up. So I think that's what they say, that it's very normal for women, and I would guess men as well, who have these challenges, to take them in as something wrong with themselves. And that's where we see this brain shame happening.
That makes so much sense. And I see that with my clients in my private practice. I'm bad at math, or I can't ever get my room clean. I'm messy, or I'm lazy. Like all these things that they take on, it's about the brain and the expectation. And when you step back and you process all the information in a way where it's neuroaffirming, it's actually completely different. The person doesn't have to be shamed. But you're right. You start to tell yourself that story and you believe it. The first thing often that pops in, that default thought is, I'm bad at, and then fill in the blank.
Yes, exactly. And I think this is one reason why it was so helpful to me to get diagnosed, is that I started to understand these are brain-based skills. It's not my fault. And I think, as many writers and experts talk about, that shame, it doesn't actually help a lot of times if you want to change a situation. In fact, it's a lot easier to make a positive change in some of these areas. I'm not saying I'm ever going to be Martha Stewart, but I think I often do a better job when I can give myself compassion and understanding. And then from there, it's easier to develop workarounds, to advocate for myself. So if my spouse is like, why are you leaving towels all over the house? My dad also said that too, and no one could ever cure me of that. I can explain that I'm really not trying to do that, and I can try to brainstorm some strategies if you really can't live with that.
If you don't learn why your brain works in the way it does, then you will have that shame, because that's what you're going to feel when you're told that you're wrong, or that you could be doing better, or that you're not trying hard enough.
Yeah, and I think one of the questions you sent me ahead of time was what makes brain shame more likely? And I hadn't reflected that on that before, but in a lot of ways, I can see how being very sensitive to what others think, which a lot of people with ADHD and autism are, could make you very susceptible, because you care a lot about what people think and you want to please them, which is true of a lot of folks. So then I think it can be easy when you receive that negative feedback to take it really hard. I think a lot of times when my husband would give me feedback about my organization in the house, and he's pretty organized, so it doesn't really completely make sense to him that my brain is really not meaning to take the stuff out of the fridge and not put it back or leave the cupboards open. I don't know what my brain's doing, but it's not tracking it. But I think I used to just take it really personally. Like, why can't he let it go? Why doesn't he understand me? And now I just realize that's probably part of his ADHD, that he also continues to be surprised by my behavior that's been the same for 20 years.
Yeah. And it's really interesting the way you learn about yourself. And if the other person, whether that's a teacher or parent or whoever, is open to learning about the child and then also themselves, like why is it hard for them to be flexible with their expectation or think about how the other person might be experiencing the world?
Yeah, and I think I'm very lucky that there's pros and cons to both having ADHD, I think, in the house, but I am lucky that it makes it a little bit easier because we've gone on this journey together of getting diagnosed recently, and our sons got diagnosed too. So I think we have more of a sense of humor and a curiosity around, oh, you do things this way. That's interesting. And oh, I do things that way.
Not shaming each other, but just saying, my brain works this way. And then the other person listening, that really starts to heal that shame in some ways. Because when we think about shame, it really spirals out over every single environment. Do you remember any situations where you felt shame in school?
I think school was an area that I really excelled in a lot of ways, which is probably one of the reasons why I wasn't diagnosed earlier. However, girls didn't have ADHD or autism back then, the 90s. So I think in a lot of ways, I feel like my set of executive function strengths actually suits school success pretty well. So I'm lucky with the attention and focus related to school, the goal-directed persistence, the time management. I was even able to harness my lack of organizational skills just with my sheer force of will, that I wanted to be good at school and I wanted to be a smart girl and those kinds of things. But I think I did face some challenges in some areas of school and I didn't know why. And I took them really hard because I cared so much about school. For example, like test taking was really hard for me. And of course, I got no accommodations on that, right? Because nobody knew. So I worked so hard and I was crushed when I got my ACT scores back because I identified with the kids that were smart and some of them just had a much easier time knocking everything out of the ballpark, including the tests. Or sometimes writing was difficult for me, like just the ideas came great, like the ADHD brain creativity, but then some of the detail-oriented organizational pieces were really challenging. And I think I really beat myself up for those problems and took them personally. And now it makes a lot of sense why those were issues for me.
I don't know how you feel about this, but for me, I wanted to be worthy. I wanted to be accepted. I didn't have a lot of control over those things that I got in trouble over, like the room, keeping that organized. Social things were hard. So I worked so hard at school, like you said, to be the smart girl or somehow get the praise of someone for something. The only way I was able to do that was to excel at school. But there's that shame of if it's not high enough, right? Maybe you're feeling like you're not as smart as you thought you were, or you're afraid that other people might think you're not.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think what you said, I really relate to that. And I think in some ways it makes kind of sense that some neurodivergent kids who felt like they related to school or somehow the school setup was really supportive, that we would dig in on it because in a lot of ways, like it's pretty structured. You get that feedback for your work in an easy way, like your grade. But for me, I think the social, I didn't understand like what would get me an A, so to speak, or I didn't at home. Luckily, I was an only child, so a lot of my challenges didn't become big issues. I think my parents probably just let it go at a certain point and said, at least she's good at school and she has one friend. I think they were like, she's okay. But I think in a lot of ways, even today in my master's program, I can tell I like much better how you get like a grade and it's very structured and you know what to do versus writing the book that's coming out was a lot more unstructured and challenging and brought up a lot more of that negative self-talk because it's a lot less clear what it means to do it well in some ways.
Do you recall for you if you experienced any brain shame around social interactions with your peers?
Yeah, definitely I did. I think in a lot of ways, I felt a lot of pressure to try and have a larger social battery. And I think some of it I couldn't really put my finger on what I was doing wrong in a lot of ways, which I guess speaks to why I probably got a diagnosis of autism, that a lot of the social dynamics didn't make sense. All I knew was that girls who weren't like me, who were popular and pretty and gregarious, and at the time, I think I thought it had to do with being thin. But then when I became thin, I was like, no, I think it's a personality thing after all. But I think whatever they had that I felt like I didn't, and that seemed to be so well received, I did feel down on myself for. And it wasn't like school where you could, do X, Y, and Z and do better. I really was flabbergasted about the whole thing. I kept trying and trying to pretend like I didn't notice that that I felt different because there was no option of being different. You had to just keep trying to seem like everybody else.
And I can see how brain shame could really be related to masking in a lot of ways.
Yeah, I think that's true. And I think in a lot of ways, I found my people that I could be more myself around. Like I mentioned, my one best friend, I could oftentimes retreat to hanging out with her when the larger social groups were more difficult. But even she, I think, sometimes would say, Catherine, you're really weird in larger groups. You talk to me, but then we go in the group, or sometimes you exit the social situation quite abruptly. And I guess that feedback didn't really make sense to me, but it did hurt because I wanted that social capital of being more having an easier time moving in and out of social situations.
So, when we're talking about brain shame, it really does touch every part of your life, right? It touches your academic life, your social life, your home life. I know we've talked a little bit about this already, but how brain shame impacts you mentally.
Yeah, I think one thing that's challenging about brain shame, and I think it's a kind of a new idea that hopefully will become more fleshed out over time. But it strikes me that some of the things like having social challenges, which is a more common setting to see girls struggle, that people wouldn't associate that as much with brain issues. Or also, like in the home, a lot of girls and women can struggle more at home with their relationships than they do at school. But I think that's another area that we wouldn't necessarily identify as brain shame, but I think it is. For example, I have a hard time with thinking on my feet, strategizing in the moment. And that's, I think, related to a lack of flexibility and also difficulty with planning and prioritization in real time. That makes parenting pretty hard. So I wouldn't recognize those moments when I feel like I botched something as a parent as being brain shame, but I think it probably is.
It's interesting that you say this because I think a lot of the people, whether you're listening because you're a parent or you're listening because you're a therapist specializing in neurodivergent kids and teens, or you're an educator, it impacts everything throughout your life. Anyone listening is going to identify with some kind of brain shame. I experienced it just yesterday with my own mom. She was telling me, you should just set a boundary and tell him that he's going to come to the table and eat with you. And that's it. A lot of us who are neurodivergent and also have neurodivergent kids, we hear a lot from different people that are neurotypical about the way that we should do things, or they have their own expectations, even when we're adults. But when they don't understand our wiring or our kids' wiring, there can definitely be shame there.
Yeah, I do think there's a lot of judgment. Certainly, a lot of people have been confused by my difficulty with being that authoritarian person, being a disciplinarian. And I think in some ways, I think it is difficult for my brain to do that in the moment and be assertive, but also I've reflected on this recently. I'm sure you've read about rejection sensitivity dysphoria. And so I think I'm really sensitive. And then a lot of us, if we have any sort of issues with authority or demand avoidance, we don't like being told what to do. And so I think somehow paired with some of my executive function makeup, I think that makes it really hard for me to tell others what to do. And maybe also because I'm an only child, I never was the big sister who like was bossy. So it just doesn't feel like me at all to do that. But a lot of people think I'm like a failed adult for not being able to really embody that.
Yeah, and I think you're right about using that terminology too. It really does feel that way. You're failing socially, or you're failing academically, or you're failing keeping your room clean, and you're failing parenting. It's all this shame, and it just feels like 1,000 pounds sometimes. I know you said earlier it's been helpful to have the diagnosis, and it's been better since. I've certainly felt, hey, I'm going to give myself permission to accept this isn't where my strength is. And I'm going to be okay with that. I have strengths in these other areas. And so I'm not going to take that shame on. And of course, it's not that easy. And I work on it every day. All of a sudden, a light bulb came on. It's not like
Right.
that. It's a daily practice. So let's talk a little bit about some support strategies.
Yeah, I do think that learning about your brain and understanding what these executive functions looks like can really help. And then starting to look across these settings where you're using the executive functions and where your strengths and challenges may all be coming up. And I think it also helps with that developing that awareness of what you really should have control over or not, because obviously if it's our brain and it has a challenge, we can't necessarily just exert willpower and be different. So that's really helpful to know. I think another piece that really helps is meeting other people who have similar issues. I think through supporting my kids with their diagnoses and meeting other parents often have challenges, meeting cultural norms of parenting as well. So that's really nice to have that support where you say, oh, it's not just me who has trouble. getting my kid to come to the table for this special dinner, which my folks in other generations would expect. That would be a marker of good parenting. So I think that really helps, just that ability to see that, oh, I'm not the only one, and others also have kids, that it doesn't make sense to force them to do things in that way or force yourself to make them do things. I listened a little to the Low Demand podcast yesterday, and I thought that was really interesting how that conversation was talking about how so much of good parenting that people expect is getting your kids to do stuff. But of course, that's really hard for your neurodivergent kids and as a neurodivergent parent to be forcing that.
It's a pressure on all of us, right? Pressure on the parents, pressure on the child. And that episode with Amanda Diekman, she's great. Those are really good support strategies. Our approach may not be the same as other parents. Maybe the child needs something in a different way, and then hopefully we'll get some accommodations in there, because a lot of times school isn't made for the way that their brain works. My 14-year-old's room, he's neurodivergent. I don't get mad at him because my relationship with him is more important than a messy room, even though I'm pretty sure there are a few things growing in there.
Yeah. And I think, Leslie Todaro, who is one of the founders of Hollowell Todaro here in Seattle, she does advocate for not really trying to get your ADHD kids to do chores, just because it's so hard on the relationship. And a lot of times those things are really hard for our kids. I think also growing up when we did, it's really hard, right, to sometimes be okay with it, right? Sometimes we are like, "Arr!" But I think maybe just also knowing that's the experience for those of us who grew up in the previous generation and just came about our diagnoses. And now we have kids that it's going to be busy in our brains, right? We're going to have one thought that's related to this kid should really be able to clean their room. And then the next thought is going to be like, no, wait, that's pretty darn hard for him. And is it worth it? If I have to pick my battles, is this really the most important thing?
It is a struggle increasing that self-awareness so you can give yourself a little bit of room, because we do feel pulled in different directions. Yeah, my son taking out the garbage is definitely not his thing, but last night he wanted to clean out the gutter in the front of the house. I'm like, let's do it.
Yeah, I'm a big
Let's seize that
proponent
opportunity.
of just when they want to do it, go for it. Like every
Let's
once in
do
a while,
it.
my son will be like, we should clean my room. And I'm like, okay, awesome. Or I need to find this paper. Let's organize my papers. Great. Sounds good.
Yeah, because it could definitely be a fight over something that doesn't really need to be a fight, because I feel pressure because that's supposed to be a kid job, right? That idea is coming from another place. It's not necessarily me. It was at the time when I grew up. So lots of good conversation here. I appreciate it. I want to talk before we get off about this book that you have coming out.
Yeah, it's the ADHD Workbook for teen girls. And I just got it in the mail. So there it is.
Oh, that's so cool. I can't wait to get it.
Yep, so it's through New Harbinger. They're the self-help book publisher, and they didn't have a ADHD workbook for teen girls, so they thought it was definitely a need out there.
Good for that publisher, because
Agreed.
there's a gap there, as we know.
And there's a lot about executive function in there. Teen girls can learn all about their personal strengths and weaknesses around these brain skills. And there's a lot of also practicing identifying cognitive distortions. If you're making the leap from I have this messy desk to I'm a mess as a person. And there's also just a lot of self-compassion for challenges, even when our teachers or parents, they may not completely always get that we're not doing certain behaviors to be frustrating to others.
I needed your book when I was a teenager. I'm sure
Me
you probably
too.
needed your own book, like the one you just wrote. That can really help them and their mental health because we know that girls, especially, they're diagnosed with anxiety and depression first, ADHD and autism later, right?
That was
And
my case too.
that was your case. Yeah. So the more that they learn about themselves earlier, this goes in for boys as well. I see so many boys with brain shame too. I am a fan of acceptance and commitment therapy. I love the idea of saying my brain is telling me a story. And, oh, my desk is messy. I'm a mess. My brain is telling me a story. I'm a mess because I guess I had this idea that what my desk is supposed to look like according to other people.
Yeah, I think that's really helpful. That's a great tip. You're just distancing yourself from that story because you're naming it as a story.
Yeah. When you were talking about not shutting the cabinets on all, oh, I can so understand that. I was just like, yep, everything you're saying.
Yeah. I'm thinking about it. I'm amazed that some people actually do open it, take it out, close it. Wow, some brains work like that. That's amazing.
Exactly. And so I love the way you're talking about brain shame and really educating all of us about it because I could say, oh, yeah, I got distracted. My brain told me another story while I was in the middle of opening up the cabinet. And then I did this other thing, which is really what happened instead of, oh, I'm so forgetful. I'm so bad at remembering things. It is such a difference for your mental health and the way that you process it.
Yeah, that's great. I like how you applied that story to that situation too. That was nice.
I am honored that I am the first person to interview you on a podcast. And I hope that you come back and see us again.
Great. Thank you so much for the opportunity. I really appreciate all your support and enthusiasm and great questions.
Thank you. I will make sure to have a link to your services and also your book down in the show notes.
Great. Thank you so much.
Thanks. You take care. Bye
You
bye.
too. Bye.
That's a wrap on today's episode. If you found this helpful, please consider hitting that like button and subscribe so you don't miss anything. And if you're thinking, oh, I know somebody who would really appreciate this episode, please send it on to them. Also, don't forget, go down to that description below because I have loaded it with free resources and information on my parent workshops and continuing education trainings for therapists. Everything you need to keep learning and growing. Thank you for being here, for caring, and for choosing neurodiversity affirming approaches. I look forward to seeing you next time on Autism ADHD TV. Take care.
All content provided is protected under applicable copyright, patent, trademark, and other proprietary rights. All content is provided for informational and educational purposes only. No content is intended to be a substitute for professional medical or psychological diagnosis, advice, or treatment. Information provided does not create an agreement for service between Holly Blanc Moses Crossvine Clinical Group, the interviewee, Holly Blanc Moses LLC, and the recipient. Consult your physician regarding the applicability of any opinions or recommendations with respect to your symptoms or medical condition or the symptoms or medical condition of your family member. Children or adults who show signs of dangerous behavior toward themselves and/or others should be placed immediately under the care of a qualified professional.